The silence that started everything, the camera never cuts. There is no music cue to soften what comes next. No dramatic fade, no helpful transition to warn you that something is about to go wrong. Instead, the moment just sits there raw, unedited, and uncomfortable. The kind of moment most people would ask to be removed in post. But it stays, and that's what makes it unsettling. You can hear it before you understand it. A hesitation in the voice, breath taken too late, pause that stretches longer than it should. It's the kind of silence that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means something already has. This wasn't supposed to be said out loud. You can feel that immediately. The speaker knows it. The room knows it. And once the words land, there's no taking them back. I never wanted what transpired between me and you too. That sentence changes the temperature instantly. Up until that point, the conversation had the appearance of reflection, casual, almost neutral. A discussion about a night out, a birthday, a moment that on the surface sounded ordinary enough to be forgettable. But ordinary moments don't produce pauses like that, and they don't produce questions like this. Are you aware of what really happened to you? The response comes quickly, but not confidently. No, I'm not. That answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it detonates it, because what happens next isn't confusion, it's contradiction. The speaker says they can talk about it, but then immediately says they're not aware of what really happened. The words trip over each other. Explanation collapses under its own weight, and that's when the tone shifts. Not dramatically, not explosively. Quietly, the breathing changes. The pacing slows. The politeness drops away. And suddenly what sounded like a casual recounting hardens into something else. Entirely accusation, frustration, and something deeper that's been sitting unresolved for a long time. You can hear it when the speaker says, "Stop being careful." That line doesn't belong in a casual conversation. It belongs in a confrontation that's been waiting for its moment. Because moments earlier, none of this was supposed to happen. At first, the story sounded harmless. A birthday, a night out. You got a vague explanation about not knowing what really happened. The kind of story people tell all the time when they don't want to get into details, but then the energy flips. The speaker leans in, not physically, but verbally. The voice tightens. And now the words are no longer descriptive. They're defensive, pointed, strategic. What's being called out isn't just confusion, it's framing. The accusation isn't that something bad happened. It's that something is being presented in a way that benefits one version of the story while quietly damaging another. According to the speaker, what's being sold publicly isn't truth, it's narrative. Carefully shaped, softened at the edges. Ambiguous enough to let the internet do the dirty work. And that's when the internet starts paying attention. Because now this isn't just about a night out anymore, it's about implication. It's about what was said publicly, what was left unsaid, and who was quietly being dragged into a story they never agreed to be part of. As the clip spreads, people begin to hear what's underneath the words. The tension doesn't feel sudden, it feels accumulated. It's like something that's been building over time. Years of side glances, moments that didn't sit right. A growing sense that history is being rewritten in real time. And then comes the line. That changes everything. The suggestion that this wasn't confusion, it was intention, that the story being told publicly does not match what happened behind closed doors, that names are being avoided on purpose, that details are being softened just enough to escape accountability while still inviting sympathy. That's when another name enters the conversation, not loudly. It's not directly, but unmistakably. And once it does, the story stops being emotional and starts becoming about credibility, because now the questions are different. Who knew what? Who was actually there? Who left hand? Who stayed? And why do certain details keep floating around the edges without ever being addressed head-on? Months pass, and the truth doesn't surface, not fully. Instead, it lingers in fragments. In comments, in reaction videos, in speculation layered on top of speculation. And just as the tension peaks, the speaker drops a final implication quietly, deliberately, that reframes everything. The suggestion that the real story may never have been told. At all, there's no dramatic reveal, no sudden confession, just a longer pause, a tightening in the voice, and the unmistakable sense that patience has run out. What started as an explanation has turned into a reckoning, and the core of that reckoning becomes clear very quickly. This isn't about gossip, it's about control. According to the speaker, the real issue isn't just what was said, it's how it was said and when, the implication of not knowing what happened, the insistence on vagueness, the repeated suggestion that the night was confusing, mysterious, unknowable. That's what lit the fuse. Because from his perspective, there was nothing mysterious about that night at all. That single line, "I don't know what happened," is what changed everything. Not because uncertainty is wrong, but because uncertainty paired with implication creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, the internet fills in the blanks. Speculation grows. Narratives form. Blame starts looking for a place to land, and once that process starts, there's no controlling where it ends. The speaker makes it clear that this wasn't some random night that can't be traced. He doesn't respond emotionally. He responds structurally, almost clinically. He reconstructs the timeline slowly, deliberately, not as a defense, but as a correction. It started simply a call, a plan to eat, a suggestion to go somewhere familiar. Nothing secretive, nothing dramatic. A group meeting up, moving through the city the way people do on an ordinary night, locations shifting, plans adjusting naturally. No surprise party, no elaborate setup, no hidden intention, and this is where the tone sharpens, because the version being told publicly, one that frames the night as some kind of generous gesture, a moment of kindness or care, doesn't align with what he remembers. He insists the framing is wrong, and worse, he believes it's deliberate. The idea that this was a birthday gesture, he says, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. In his version, the night unfolded casually. People moved. Conversations shifted. Energy changed. At no point did it resemble the emotional story later. It's presented online, and then comes the real turning point. What bothered him wasn't even the night itself. It was what happened after. Because once the story hit the internet, it didn't stay factual. It didn't stay contained. It turned into something else entirely. A narrative filled with implication. Mentions of waking up injured, references to blood, statements that suggested near death without explanation. Those words didn't exist in isolation. They existed in public. And once they did, silence became interpretation. The internet became a courtroom without evidence. And that's when discomfort turned into something much heavier. Because according to the speaker, this unease didn't appear overnight. Rooted in behavior that made him uncomfortable long before any controversy went public, blurred boundaries, proximity that felt intentional, energy that shifted in ways he couldn't ignore. As the night progressed, locations changed. Plans kept moving. And at a certain point, he didn't even want to continue, but he went along anyway, until it became clear to him that he was no longer part of the equation. And that's where the story darkens. Not because of confrontation, but because of exclusion. When the night reached its most uncomfortable point, a decision was made. He didn't go upstairs. He didn't follow. He didn't insert himself into whatever came next. He left. That decision quiet. Unremarkable in the moment, would later become the dividing line between what he knows and what he refuses to speculate about. But it would also become the very thing people used against him. Because once the narrative took hold online, the questions changed. Why didn't you stay? Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you do more? And that's when frustration hardened into anger. He refuses to accept responsibility for something he wasn't present for. Whatever happened after that door closed happened out of his sight, beyond his control, and in the presence of people who have yet to fully explain themselves. If anyone knows what happened, he implies, it's the people who stayed. He doesn't accuse directly. He doesn't say names with certainty. But the boundary he draws is sharp enough to feel. He knows what he saw. He knows when he left. And he knows who remained behind. And that's where the emotional core of this section lands. Because from his point of view, the real betrayal wasn't what happened that night. It was what happened afterward. When silence became suspicion by the time the story reached the internet, it no longer belonged to anyone involved. That's the part people often underestimate. Once a narrative leaves a private space and enters the public arena, it stops operating on truth and starts operating on reaction. Context collapses. Nuance disappears. Emotion takes the wheel. And the loudest interpretation becomes the accepted one. That's exactly what happened here, according to the speaker. The moment vague statements were release statements implying confusion, injury, fear, the reaction was immediate. People didn't pause to ask questions. They didn't wait for clarification. They didn't ask who was present, who left, or what could actually be verified. They filled in the blanks, and those blanks didn't stay. Neutral, they leaned toward suspicion, toward accusation, toward the most dramatic explanation possible, because ambiguity doesn't exist in isolation online. It invites speculation, and speculation demands a target. The speaker describes watching it unfold in real time, the comments, the messages, the reaction videos. People speaking with absolute certainty about events they could not possibly know. Timelines were assumed. Motives were assigned. Guilt was distributed, all based on fragments. And what disturbed him most wasn't just that misinformation spread, it was that no one stopped it. Because according to him, if someone truly didn't know what had happened, to them, the next step wouldn't be a public interview. It wouldn't be implication. It wouldn't be leaving breadcrumbs for strangers. To interpret it, it would be answers. It would be doctors, authorities, private conversations, clarity instead. What followed was silence paired with suggestion, and that combination is volatile. He points out a contradiction that sits at the center of the entire situation, one that never quite got addressed, but never went away either. On one hand, the story implies confusion, waking up injured, not knowing what happened, feeling scared. On the other, it includes moments of decisiveness, refusing medical attention, declining an ambulance, making choices. Those two versions don't sit comfortably together. You can't be too disoriented to understand what happened, but clear-headed, enough to make medical decisions, at least not without explanation. And yet, no explanation came. That's where disbelief turns into frustration, because while the story remained vague, the consequences became very real. The internet doesn't wait for clarification. It moves forward, decides. And once it does, reversing that decision becomes nearly impossible. The speaker says what hurt most wasn't just being misunderstood, it was being mischaracterized. Painted as someone careless, someone dismissive, someone who didn't care enough to stay. But from his perspective, leaving was the most responsible choice he could have made. He removed himself because the situation made him uncomfortable, because boundaries felt crossed, because staying would have meant inserting himself into something he did not consent to be part of. And yet, the court of public opinion, that absence became evidence. Evidence of guilt. Evidence of neglect. Evidence of something darker. He circles back to that night again, not to relive it, but to underline one fact that keeps getting ignored. He left. He didn't go upstairs. He didn't stay behind. Didn't witness what happened next. That distinction matters, or at least it should have, because logic dictates that responsibility follows presence. If you weren't there, you can't explain what happened. Left, you can't be accountable for what occurred afterward, and yet, he was the one being questioned. That's where the anger resurfaces. Not explosive, not chaotic, but exhausted. The kind of anger that comes from being positioned as a scapegoat, while others remain silent. He talks about how the story evolved once it escaped its original context. Blogs picked it up. Commentary channels dissected it. Clips were replayed, slowed down, analyzed frame by frame. People assigned meaning to pauses, intent to tone, motive to silence. And all of it happened without a single definitive correction. That's what he can't understand. He insists that at any point, simple clarification could have stopped the spiral. A statement saying nothing happened. A boundary, a correction. But instead, The narrative was allowed to breathe, to grow, to mutate, and once that happens, it develops a life of its own. That's when he says something revealing, something that reframes the situation beyond a single incident. He suggests this pattern isn't new, that ambiguity, confusion, and drama seem to follow the same person repeatedly, that situations have a way of becoming chaotic without ever being fully explained. He stops short of calling it intentional, but he doesn't deny that it's habitual. What hurts most, he says, isn't even the backlash, it's the feeling of being used as a backdrop. A name floated just close enough to implication without being stated outright, close enough to invite suspicion, distant enough to avoid accountability. Collateral. And then he says the line that shifts the entire story. He says the only person truly wronged by all of this isn't him, it's Yandy. That name lands differently. Up until now, Yandy has barely existed in the public narrative. But suddenly, everything snaps into focus. The discomfort, the unease. It's the reason boundaries mattered so much. The reason the night never sat right. While the internet obsessed over shock value and speculation, the real damage was happening quietly away from cameras, away from comment sections. In a space where trust was being strained and relationships were being tested, Yandy didn't ask to be part of this. She didn't choose to be associated with vague accusations or online speculation. And yet her name became inseparable from a story she didn't create. That realization changes the tone again now. This isn't about gossip. It's about boundaries, about trust being violated, about how easily someone else's life can become collateral damage when a story is turned into content. By the end of this section, tension isn't just emotional anymore. It's moral. The question is no longer what happened that night. The question becomes, why was this ever allowed to become a story at all? And in the next part, the speaker finally confronts that question, directly breaking down the moment everything crossed a line, and why, in his view, the damage can't be undone. When staying quiet became its own crime by the time the story reached this stage, something irreversible had already happened. It was no longer about clearing up confusion. It was no longer about misunderstandings or hurt feelings. It was about consequence. Once a narrative reaches a certain size, it stops belonging to the people who started it, becomes public property. And when that happens, everyone connected to it is forced to respond whether they want to or not. The speaker makes it clear that by this point, the damage wasn't theoretical. It was already unfolding in real time. Blogs had locked onto the story. Comment sections had turned into courtrooms. Names that never should have been associated with the situation were now permanently tied to it. Through search results and speculation, he describes watching this happen with a kind of disbelief, not because people were talking, but because of how confidently they spoke about things, as they could not possibly know. Assumptions were louder than facts. Emotion outweighed evidence. And once that balance tipped, truth struggled to survive. What bothered him most wasn't criticism. He had been in the public eye long enough to understand how judgment works online. What unsettled him was how easily people accepted a version of events that had never been fully explained. While ignoring the inconsistencies sitting right in front of them, there was no follow-up, no investigation, a reconciliation of conflicting details. Just a narrative that felt right emotionally, and therefore became believable. That, he says, is where the real danger lies. Because when emotion replaces evidence, people stop asking questions. They don't want complexity. They want clarity. They want a villain. They want someone to blame. And in this case, he was convenient. The speaker emphasizes that he never intended for any of this to escalate. In fact, he says the opposite, that he stayed quiet precisely to prevent this outcome. He believed that engaging publicly would only pour fuel on an already unstable situation. For a long time, silence felt like the responsible choice. But silence, he learned, is rarely neutral. In the absence of explanation, silence becomes implication. It becomes a blank screen onto which people project whatever story makes the most sense to them, and slowly, that silence began to work against him. He admits that it hurt to be perceived as someone careless, someone indifferent, someone who would walk away from a situation involving a friend without concern. From his perspective, That image couldn't be further from the truth. He stepped away because he cared. He stepped away because boundaries mattered. He stepped away because inserting himself into a situation that already felt wrong would have crossed a line he wasn't willing to cross. And yet, that decision was reframed as abandonment. Once again, returns to the same distinction, because it's the one detail that keeps being ignored. He left. He didn't go upstairs. He didn't stay behind. He didn't witness what happened next. He never claimed to know what occurred after that moment. He never pretended to have answers he didn't possess. And he refuses to speculate simply to satisfy public curiosity. If anyone knows what happened, he repeats, it's the people who were actually there. That statement isn't an accusation. It's a boundary. A refusal to carry responsibility for something he didn't see. But that boundary wasn't respected online. Instead, his absence became suspicious. His restraint became questionable. His refusal to speculate became guilt by omission. That's when frustration deepened into disappointment, because the situation could have been handled quietly, privately, with respect for everyone involved. A conversation, a clarification. Moment of honesty instead became content. It became clicks. It became something people consumed for entertainment. And once that happened, truth stopped being the priority. He talks about how quickly empathy online transforms into outrage. Outrage has no patience for nuance. Once people pick a side, they don't want new information. They want confirmation. And confirmation doesn't require accuracy. It only requires repetition. What makes this section especially heavy is when he finally addresses the part no one wanted to focus on while everyone was dissecting his role. The real fallout was happening elsewhere quietly, away from the cameras. In spaces where trust was being strained and relationships were absorbing damage they didn't ask for. That's when he brings up Yandy again, not dramatically, not defensively, but with resignation. He suggests that while the internet was busy speculating, she was the one dealing with the consequences. Her name pulled into conversations she never consented to. Her relationship placed under scrutiny because of someone else's narrative choices, and that, to him, is what makes the entire situation unforgivable. Not the rumors, not the blogs, not the comment sections, but the fact that someone else had to absorb the damage of a story they didn't create at that point. He admits something shifted inside him. He stopped caring how he looked. He stopped worrying about being labeled messy or dramatic. Because once someone else's life is affected, protecting your own image starts to feel irrelevant. That's when he decided to speak. Not to clear his name. Not to attack. Not to accuse. But to draw a line. To say clearly and publicly, this is where my involvement ends. This is what I know. This is what I don't. And everything beyond that belongs to the people who were actually there. By the end of this section, nothing feels resolved. There are no clean answers. No satisfying conclusions. No dramatic confessions. Just a heavy, unresolved tension. Because one thing has become painfully clear. The story people thought they understood is far more complicated than it appeared. And in the final stretch, that complexity turns into something else entirely, because the conversation shifts from explanation to consequence, from confusion to accountability. When the story stops belonging to anyone by the time the story reaches this point, something fundamental has changed. It's no longer about who said what first. It's no longer about confusion, misunderstanding, or even hurt feelings. What hangs in the air now is consequence. Because once a narrative grows large enough, it stops belonging to any single person. It becomes public. And when that happens, everyone connected to it, directly or indirectly, is forced to carry some version of the fallout, even the people who never asked to be part of it. The speaker makes it clear that by this stage, the damage was already done. Speculation had spread too far to be pulled back. Blogs had archived their headlines. Comment sections had hardened into verdicts. Names that should never have been attached to the situation were now permanently linked to it in search results. An online memory, he describes watching this unfold with a strange mix of disbelief and resignation. Not because people were talking that was inevitable, but because of how certain they were. People spoke as if they had been there, as if they had seen what happened, as if fragments of a story were enough to equal truth. Assumptions became louder than facts. Emotion drowned out evidence. And once that happens, truth struggles to survive. What unsettled him most wasn't being criticized. Public judgment comes with visibility. He understood that. What disturbed him was how easily people accepted a version of events that had never been fully explained. While ignoring the contradictions sitting plainly in front of them, there was no follow-up. No attempt to reconcile timelines. No effort to address inconsistencies. Just a story that felt emotionally satisfying, therefore became believable. That, he says, is where things went truly wrong, because when emotion replaces evidence, people stop asking questions. They don't want complexity. They want simplicity. They want someone to blame. And once a villain is chosen, nuance becomes inconvenient. He explains that he never intended for the situation to escalate. In fact, he deliberately stayed silent because he believed speaking publicly would only inflame things further. Silence, at the time, felt like restraint. Like respect, but silence has a cost. In a vacuum, silence becomes meaning. It becomes implication. It becomes a blank space the internet fills with its own conclusions. And slowly, painfully, that silence turned into suspicion. He admits it hurt to be seen as careless, to be portrayed as someone indifferent, as someone who walked away without concern. From his perspective, the truth was the opposite. He stepped away because boundaries mattered. He stepped away because the situation felt wrong. Because staying would have meant crossing a line he wasn't willing to cross. Still, absence became guilt. Once again, he draws the same boundary because it's the only one that matters. He left. He didn't go upstairs. He didn't stay behind. He didn't witness what happened next. He never claimed otherwise, never pretended to know more than he did. And he refuses to speculate simply to satisfy public curiosity. If anyone knows what happened, he makes clear it's the people who were actually there. That statement isn't meant to accuse, it's meant to limit responsibility, to define where his involvement ends. But by then, the story had already outgrown logic. At this stage, the conversation isn't about facts anymore. It's about perception. Perception doesn't care about restraint. What makes this final section especially heavy is the sense of finality in his tone. He doesn't sound angry, doesn't sound defensive. He sounds tired. Tired of being misrepresented. Tired of watching half-truths spread faster than facts. Tired of seeing something that could have been handled quietly turn into something public and destructive. And yet, even in that exhaustion, there's clarity. He says he doesn't regret speaking up, only waiting as long as he did, because by the time he finally addressed it, the story had already grown legs. And once a narrative starts walking on its own, you can't control where it goes. He acknowledges that people will continue to have opinions. Some will believe him. Others won't. Once narratives harden, they rarely soften. But what he refuses to accept is being painted as the architect of something he didn't create. So he draws his final line. He will not continue engaging in implication and response. He has said what he knows, has stated what he does not, and whatever conclusions people draw from here belong to them. To him, that moment lingers. Because by the time the story ends, it becomes clear this was never really about one night, or even one accusation. It was about how quickly narratives form, how silence can be misread, and how devastating it can be when truth becomes secondary to drama. As the tension settles, one question remains, and it hangs over everything like a shadow. If the truth was always more complicated than it seemed, why was the world so quick to accept the simplest version? And that question doesn't have a clean answer, because now, story sits with you. What began as a night out became a narrative. That narrative became speculation, and speculation became judgment long before anyone had all the facts. So the real question isn't just what happened that night. The real question is, who gets to control the story once it leaves the room? Was this a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control? Was it a situation made worse by silence and implication? Or was it something that should have been handled privately long before it ever reached the internet? And perhaps the hardest question of all when someone says they don't know what happened, is that confusion or avoidance? Because as you've heard, parts of this story don't line up neatly. Timelines feel blurred. Reactions raise more questions than they answer. And people caught in the middle never asked to carry the fallout. So now it's your turn. What do you believe? You think the truth was intentionally left vague? Do you believe silence made things worse? Or was it the only option? You think truly paid the price once the cameras stopped rolling? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Read what others are saying. Real conversations happen there. And if you're here because you care about stories, beyond headline stories, where timelines matter, words matter, and silence has consequences, make sure you support the channel. Like the video if this breakdown made you think, subscribe for deeper, fact-driven celebrity analysis, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. This channel focuses on clear, carefully examined narratives, not rumors, not shortcuts, not clickbait. Because some stories don't end when the interview does. They only begin.